3 acceptable sentences for cheating on my husband. As Phil and I and 4 friends drove down the open highway, I reflected on how he, Amy Thomas, née Williams, and I ended up together. At various points, I thought it would never happen. But here we have been married for 5 years, and I am 6 months pregnant. I met Phil Thomas shortly after graduating from college. We met on a bike club ride that I participated in with my roommate Katie. Actually, Phil wasn't the first guy on the ride who made a big impression on me. It was Phil's friend Don Reston. Don was probably the best-looking guy I'd ever seen, especially considering his body in his tight bike shorts. When Kathy noticed my gaze, she said, "Obviously fake," which caused us both to laugh out loud. While Don was a 10 in the looks department, yes, women can rate guys too, and it's not just one way, Phil Thomas was definitely no slouch. I rated him a 9 to 9.5. Don seemed concerned about a 10 woman who shouldn't have been riding a bike because her large breasts made her unbalanced. But Phil quickly got my interest, and a third guy, unrelated to Don and Phil, named Jeremy, was riding Kathy. Everyone on the ride was pleasant and seemed to be having a good time. Don was especially nice when he was introduced to me, as my knees were suddenly a little weak. I must have been pedaling too hard. Phil got my phone number and the promise of a date. Jeremy got the body of that cheating Katie, and their activities in the adjoining bedroom kept me awake most of the night. Since it wasn't unusual for Kathy to do this, although I liked her, I moved into my own apartment within 2 months of this, specifically as soon as I could afford it. I liked Phil a lot. I only had 2 problems with him. The first problem with Phil was that he drank alcohol. As the daughter of an alcoholic father, I don't drink and I don't allow it as an excuse for bad behavior. Someone who has had an alcohol-related accident would not want me on a jury. I would give him or her a life sentence if I could. The second problem with Phil was that he seemed to have a wandering eye. I am a firm believer in monogamy, and if I didn't have that confidence in my partner, he wouldn't be my partner. The first time Phil used alcohol as an excuse for his behavior, which was consistent with him canoodling with another woman at the club, he became aware of my intolerance. At that point, he and I had been intimate for about a month, and unless he was the biggest faker in history, he really liked my body. After confronting him on the dance floor, and the woman he had feelings for pushed me and ended up on my back with a broken nose, I jumped out of the house, walked a couple blocks to make sure he couldn't find me, and then hailed a cab. When Phil came to my apartment the next day to apologize, he used a profanity that would have made General Patton proud. Having had enough, he asked what he could do to rectify the situation. "It's your problem, not mine. Think about it for 2 weeks and give me 3 possible solutions, and then I'll tell you if one of them is acceptable." "But you're coming with me to my cousin's wedding next Saturday, right?" he asked. "No, I won't see you until 2 weeks from now. Find another date," I growled. He stammered, But, as I pushed him out the door. I had no idea if he went to his cousin's wedding with or without a date the following week until he came to see me exactly 2 weeks after my ultimatum. Phil was very humble, not his usual confident self, when he walked into my apartment. I wasn't hostile, but I only allowed him to give me a peck on the cheek when he walked in. After a little small talk, he got straight to the point. "Amy, I only want to offer you one solution, and it has 2 parts. 1, I got a 3-month prescription for naltrexone to eradicate the cravings for alcohol. The second is that I have written confirmation from your former roommate Kathy, with whom I went to my cousin's wedding, that I have behaved like an impeccable gentleman the entire time." After making these bold statements, he handed me a vial of Vivitrol pills, the brand name for naltrexone, labeled with 30 pills and 2 refills, and a piece of paper. I looked into the vial, which already had about 10 pills in it, but it did say Vivitrol on it, so it was real and not a fake. The document was interesting, too. It was Kathy's affidavit, signed before a notary, stating that she had gone with Phil to his cousin's wedding, and, despite her intrusive comments and actions, he kept his hands to himself the entire time and didn't drink at the reception. In fact, he didn't take advantage of her even when she got drunk. Although Kathy is a cheater, she never lied to me about anything substantial in the 3 years I knew her, and we had no hard feelings when I stopped sharing a room with her. She understood my reasons. So I decided that the document was probably true. But to make sure, I called her and talked to her right in front of Phil. I knew I could tell by the tone of her voice if she was lying. After the conversation, I was convinced she was telling the truth. When I interrupted the conversation, Phil looked at me expectantly. "I agree, provided it doesn't happen again and you take naltrexone for all 3 months," I told him. He smiled broadly, kissed me soundly, and invited me to dinner that same night. After dinner and an hour of dancing, I decided that Phil needed a reward, so I took him to my apartment and did my best to reward him. He was of the same opinion, and when we made love, we both succeeded. The next morning we were exhausted but very happy. That night and Phil's change in attitude was the beginning of our love affair. Although Phil still seemed to have a wandering eye, what guy doesn't wander to one degree or another, he was the perfect partner. So almost a year after that night we were married. Don was one of the groomsmen, Kathy one of the bridesmaids. For some reason I can't adequately explain to myself, I was glad they didn't hit it off, though Kathy didn't try to do so. Married life was between good and very good for 4 years. Then I wouldn't say it got bad, because it didn't. But Phil seemed to take a more wandering view than before. I had no particular reason to believe he was cheating or even willing or capable of cheating. But my misgivings robbed me of my happiness for a while. However, after about 3 months of my misgivings, after some very enjoyable lovemaking one night, Phil pressed our noses against each other and asked, "When is it time for our first child? I'm ready." The next week I had my IUD removed, and 6 weeks later I was pregnant. I felt good during the pregnancy and Phil was attentive. However, I was concerned that he stopped being interested in sex as soon as I started showing. My libido did not decrease in the slightest after the pregnancy and may have even increased a bit. His excuse was that he didn't want to harm the baby, which, from my perspective, was a long shot, and I didn't see how making love could harm the baby. Our friends' reactions to my pregnancy were very different. Kathy, who had married a nice guy named Jim and swore to me that she was reformed, was very curious. She really wanted to have children, but she didn't like the thought of her body changing much. I assured her, using statistics provided by my OBGYN, that for most women it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to recover from childbirth, and if you exercise regularly, about 4 to 6 months to feel and look the same as before pregnancy. Jim was always smiling and complimenting me on my appearance. Most of our other friends always made some sort of remark about it, but never wanted to focus on my pregnancy. The most unusual was Don's reaction. Whenever Don saw me, he would smile broadly, say, "Please, can I touch your belly?" Some people didn't ask, which annoyed me. And when I agreed, he would gently stroke it for 30 or 40 seconds and then say, "You look and feel good, very good," which made me blush because it didn't change my initial impression of him as the most handsome guy I had ever met, and, as I got to know him, the nicest. Every year that we were married, Phil and I took a summer vacation of at least 10 days, usually 2 weeks. Often we flew by airplane, but sometimes we drove. Sometimes it was just the 2 of us, sometimes with 1 or 2 other couples. This year we decided not to fly, but to drive for many reasons, including my pregnancy, and take a road trip from our home in suburban Chicago to several places in the West, including national parks and monuments. Kathy, Jim, Don, and Don's latest big-breasted girlfriend really wanted to go with us. Somehow, all of them, using the holiday weekend, were able to carve out 15 days. I worked for a company with the best maternity benefits I had ever heard of, so I started my maternity leave the day we left. We rented a small RV, big enough to hold the 6 of us and all of our luggage. It wasn't big enough for camping, but that didn't matter since the 3 women didn't like camping. I wasn't actually consulted about the makeup of our group, just asked to approve it when we were all together, and the other 5 had obviously already started making plans. It wasn't that I didn't like the other people. Jim was very nice, and Don's girlfriend, Jan, who probably got grades according to the size of her cup, i.e. not too smart, was easy to get along with, as long as the conversation didn't get too intellectual. Kathy, of course, had been my friend for a long time, but I still marveled at her freewheeling lifestyle and didn't want anything to come up between her and Jim that would cause a heated argument. And finally, Don was just chock full of good looks and tried to be nice to everyone far more than any other good-looking guy I'd ever seen. So he made me nervous and caused unsolicited twitches in various parts of my body. Anyway, we hit the road. We spent the first 2 nights in Minneapolis, seeing the city and going to the Mall of America. After that, we stopped in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, took a hot air balloon ride, went to a water show, and rode our bikes through beautiful parks. Jen and I only rode half the distance the others did, me because of the size of my belly and her because of the size of her breasts, but had just as much fun. After 2 nights in Sioux Falls, we traveled to Mount Rushmore and Custer Park before spending 1 night in Rapid City. The next day, we went to Devil's Tower, the weirdest place I've ever seen in my life. We walked around a bit, Jen and I the least, and went to the visitor center where the park ranger gave a great presentation. The next night, we stayed in a quaint motel near the highway and then drove to the Harrison Stalker Resort in St. Xavier, Montana, our first extended stay destination. The surrounding area of the resort was beautiful. Activities included visiting the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, hiking, boating, and maybe even swimming in a wetsuit. Hunting and fishing were also available, but not for me. I wanted to read and just relax, after all. It is a vacation. Phil and I stayed in one small cabin, Jim and Kathy in another, and Dawn, much wealthier than the rest of us, and Jan in a larger cabin. All the cabins were luxurious. On our second day at the resort, things went a bit wrong. Kathy and Jan wanted to go hiking, Dawn and I wanted to go to the Little Bighorn Monument, and Jim and Phil wanted to go fishing. We all ended up doing what we wanted to do, but unfortunately Dawn was too nice and thoughtful during our outing, and I came back with wet laundry. Since Phil had no desire to make love to me, I almost lost my mind, although since he did make love to me once, I stayed sane even if I wasn't satisfied. The next day, Jim and Dawn decided they wanted to go hunting with an overnight stay. The rest of us weren't interested, so we sat around doing nothing for most of the day, although Phil and Kathy did some hiking, and Jan and I went for a swim in our wetsuits. In the evening after dinner, I was tired. Swimming had taken all the strength out of my pregnant body, so I left the 3 of them at the lodge bar and headed for bed. When Phil kissed me, he murmured, "No more than 1 beer for me, honey." I tried to read in bed, but the book was falling over, so I turned off the light and soon found myself in dreamland. Except I wasn't dreaming. Instead, I had a premonition. When I woke up to go to the cleaners around 1 o'clock in the morning, Phil still wasn't in the room. I got dressed and went in search of him. Neither he, Jen, nor Kathy were in the cabin. I walked past Dawn and Jen's cabin. The bedroom window was open, and despite the lack of interior lighting, I could clearly see Jen in bed in the moonlight. I then walked to Jim and Kathy's cabin, where the bedroom window was also open, and a low bedside lamp was burning. Much to my dismay, Kathy was having sex with Phil. They were mumbling something to each other, but their speech was slurred, indicating at least some degree of intoxication. I took a few pictures on my iPhone, trying to get a good look at their faces, and a short video. My pregnancy hormones started to swell, and I got out of there before I finally burst into tears. I packed up most of my stuff and headed to the lodge, trying to hold back the tears. On my smartphone, I found a SkyWest Delta flight from Billings to Chicago that was leaving at 5:45 a.m. with 1 connection and would have me at Chicago O'Hare Airport by about 11 a.m. I wasn't going to inconvenience Don, Jan, and Jim by taking a small van, so I begged one of the fishermen telling tall tales to his friends at the lodge to give me a ride about 75 miles to the airport in Billings, Montana. He was kind enough to agree, but on the condition that I drive him there so he could sober up before the return trip. At the airport, I gave him $100 and gave him a kiss. He seemed to leave happy. At the airport, I managed to hold back sobs. I had about 2 hours to think before my flight was announced. I came to several conclusions during that time, but the most timely one was to send an email to Phil and Kathy's cell phones as soon as I got the call. To the email, I attached the most graphic photo I had taken during their little date. The body of the email contained just one word: assholes. Then I turned my phone off. When I turned my phone back on after getting home around 1 p.m., I saw missed calls from both Kathy and Phil. My conversation with Phil could wait until he returned. Right now, I needed information from Kathy, and I had a lot of leverage with her. I called her, and she answered on the first ring. "Amy, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I was just in such shock," she started before I said the first word. "Shut up, you cheating bitch," I shouted into the phone. "I don't want to hear your bullshit, so don't say another word unless it's an honest answer to a question. Understood?" I received a meek yes in response. "I know more than you think after looking through Phil's cell phone that he so conveniently left in our room," I began. It was a lie, but I was willing to bet she wouldn't risk it. "If you answer my questions honestly, I won't send Jim the pictures and videos I have, but one lie and they'll come out this afternoon, okay?" Another meek yes. "How long have you been having sex with Phil?" Since you were 4 months pregnant, 2 months or so," she answered so quietly that I almost didn't hear her. "And how many times?" "Once or twice a week, maybe," was another barely audible reply. "Where?" "Mostly at my apartment in the middle of the afternoon." "Why?" Yeah, I've always liked Phil, and I couldn't resist him when he said you're no longer interested in sex once you're 3 months pregnant." "I'm sorry," she replied, and then started sobbing. "Yeah, I can't stop being a cheater." I knew everything she said had to be true, except, of course, for Phil's lie about me not wanting sex. It was disadvantageous for her to tell me everything, knowing that I would probably never speak to her again. She was just trying to stop Jim from finding out. "I believe you, so I won't send Jim what I have right now. However, if he ever asks me a question to which the information I have pertains, I will answer him honestly. Also, never, ever speak to me again. Don't write me, don't email me, don't call me, nothing. If you do, Jim's email will be blocked immediately. Do you understand?" screamed I shouted. I think I heard a yes before I cut the conversation short. I was surprisingly calm after one of my bridesmaids admitted to having sex with my husband a dozen times or so, but I decided that at least now I would keep my promise not to send Jim what I had. I wondered if it would come out anyway. Surely Don and Jim would want an explanation as to why I'd left, and surely the rest of the vacation wouldn't be as pleasant as it had been. So, what to do about Phil? The first thing I did was send all my photos and a short video to Anita Hall, a family law attorney with whom we were very friendly through the fitness club we went to. I asked her to make and keep suitable copies on different media. I then did a little research on Illinois family law and found that the only grounds for divorce are irreconcilable differences, although adultery can play a role in irreconcilable differences. I also checked out how child custody is usually handled, what to do with property before division, etc., and prepared. I called Anita to get all the nuanced information I could. I was a little surprised when Phil showed up the next day. Apparently, he felt that he needed to act quickly to deal with the aftermath and didn't stick around for the rest of the vacation. He, too, flew home from Billings, probably on the same flight as me, but a day late. I managed to move his stuff into the guest bedroom, but didn't have time to do everything else I was going to do. At least Phil didn't insult me by making excuses about drinking. He knew it would piss me off. And he looked chagrined. However, he had only a small hope of preventing me from divorcing him. After 10 minutes of apologizing, during which I just sat there looking at him, with tears in each of our eyes, he asked, "What can I do to save our marriage, baby?" After a pregnant pause, including a kick to the stomach from the little rascal inside of me, I replied, "It's your slip-up, not mine. Just like the situation before our wedding, when your drunken body was fumbling with that fool in the Pri-SM nightclub. You have to find a solution. I will give you 3 chances to present an acceptable proposal, and if none of them are to my liking, I will file for divorce. In the meantime, if you plan to stay here, you will pay for all meals on your own. Also, you should know that my attorney, Anita Hall, has frozen all of our accounts except the checking account, and you need to sign an agreement that she will send you emails to make sure you don't withdraw more than $500 a week. The mortgage and utilities will still be paid automatically, but no more than that." With those words, I got up, got in my car, and drove to the fitness club to get a couple hours of pregnancy-approved exercise, and then make myself dinner. For the entire next week, I wasn't rude to Phil, but I wasn't lukewarm either. A couple times, especially on the weekends, he would say, "Amy, could you just give me a hint about what I could do?" My invariable response was, "You screwed up, you deal with it." After Phil had been home for about 10 days, he called me from his office and told me he was going to play on the bowling team instead of the guy from his office and wouldn't be home until late. "Okay," was my only response, and I was about to cut the conversation short when he said, "Also, Don's coming over tonight to pick up the papers on my desk. Would you mind giving them to him?" "No problem," I replied, though the thought made me wince. Don arrived earlier than I expected, just as I was about to start dinner. I was making vegetable stir-fry with rice, a dish whose proportions were easy to change, so I asked him if he wanted to stay for dinner. "That would be great," he replied enthusiastically. He helped chop the vegetables, did a few chores at my request, and poured us both seltzer, after which we sat down to eat. Like me, Don doesn't drink alcohol. Over dinner, Don and I made mostly pleasant conversation. I asked him about Jen. He replied, "I broke up with her." "Why?" I asked. "She's nice, but she's not very smart. Plus, I think she's gotten clingy, even though I told her before the trip that it didn't mean our relationship was progressing, and I'm really looking for a different type, you could say," Don replied. "What type?" I giggled. "With even bigger breasts?" Don laughed but didn't say anything back, just changed the subject. Thanks to Don's big body and my pregnant body, we ate every last grain of rice and pod of peas. Don also helped wash the dishes without being asked and complimented me on my food several times. Being in such close proximity to Don, I flushed a little and decided to distract him. "I understand Phil has some paperwork for you," I said. Yeah," he replied without enthusiasm. "Let me get them for you," I replied, heading towards Phil's home office. When I returned and handed him the documents, Don said embarrassed, "Amy, there's something I'd like to talk to you about. Do you have a minute?" "Sure," I replied hesitantly. We sat down in the chairs in the living room. Don looked nervous, but he finally spoke up. "I don't know all the details, but I know that Phil messed up and that he's trying to figure out a way to save your marriage. Is there anything you can tell me that I could use to set him on the right path?" "He asked you to talk to me. Be honest, Don, I'll understand if you're lying," I replied. Don thought for a moment, perhaps pondering how he could parse his words without lying or admitting that Phil had set him up. Finally, he couldn't seem to come up with anything, so he answered honestly, "Yes, but if possible, please don't tell him I told you." "Do you know what he did?" asked I. "Not really, just enough to know it was serious or you wouldn't have left our vacation in the middle of it," he replied. "He cheated on me with Kathy about a dozen times, including the night you were out hunting," I snapped back. Don looked slightly shocked. "Wow, that's something that can be forgiven." "Given that, what do you think he should do?" I asked. Don thought for a moment. Then he began listing, with pauses between each phrase, what Phil had probably given him straight from stories about cheating spouses on the internet. When he got to the words, "maybe ask you to have an affair," before he finished that thought, I asked him, "With whom, Don?" With whom I would be attractive enough, and he would be attractive enough for me, and who would also give me enough time to call us even. And would it be just once or as many times as he had sex with Kathy? I don't know if I did it unconsciously or not. I'd like to believe I did it unconsciously. But I noticed later that around this time I had pulled my skirt up around my hips. I noticed Don looking at my body. Well, who would you, want?" Stammering, he asked. After a pause with a smirk, I replied, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe Brad Pitt, maybe Patrick Kane, or Chris Bryant, or even you if you weren't so fixated on big breasts." Don visibly faltered. He made a very serious expression on his face and then started to sweat. I lifted my skirt slightly, not knowing if I was disgusting him with my pregnant body or attracting him. Don, stammering, listed a few more possible ways Phil could make it up to me, then wiped his forehead and, casting one last glance at my legs, stood up and said, "Well, something to think about before I see Phil again. Thanks for dinner." He then gave me a quick hug and walked out the door with the papers in his hands. When Don left, I wondered if I had been too cocky, but then I shrugged and fell asleep before Phil got back from bowling. 2 nights later, Phil called and said he was bringing home Chinese food. After we ate and he cleaned up, he said, "Can we talk in the living room?" I nodded yes and sat down in the same chair in the living room that I sat in when I talked to Don. When Phil came in, he got right to the point. "Amy, I have a suggestion that will help us get over my mistake. I've signed up for a love addiction class." He started, but was interrupted by my laughter. "That's a load of garbage, but go on. Maybe that and other things will help," I said. I also made an appointment with a counselor to learn how to control myself better," he said with a half smile. He seemed to be waiting for me to respond, so I said, "Not enough, but go ahead." He looked very uncomfortable. "I don't know how you'll react to this, but how about you have an affair?" "For how long?" I inquired. "Look, I want you to know that the thought of being with someone else has made me realize how much I've hurt you. It's very hard for me to even agree to let you have an affair even once. I don't think I can take much more," he mumbled. "With who?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Whoever you want," he muttered. "Who's your best friend? Don?" "Well, sure, at least my best local friend," he grumbled. "Good. Then ask Don to make love to me. Have him schedule a weekend, that is Friday night through Sunday night, to take me to a resort that you'll pay for. If you do that, plus bogus love addiction courses and trips to the counselor, I'll give our marriage a chance," I said sternly as I stood up and left the room. "But Amy, be reasonable?" He started to whine. "Shut up," I snapped back, turning to him with a frown on my face. "Either I get the name, date, and time of your psychologist's appointment and literature about your course from Don by next Thursday, or Anita will file divorce papers next Friday." With those words, I grabbed my gym bag and, even though it was already evening, drove to the fitness club to unwind a little. I didn't expect Phil or Don to agree to my counteroffer. Figuring this would be my last week before the divorce proceedings began, I saw no reason to be angry with Phil. I just accepted it. I even cooked him dinners until Wednesday night. On Thursday morning, I called Anita to make sure all the divorce papers were prepared and to let her know that I would call Friday morning to confirm. I barely had time to hang up before the phone rang. The caller ID said, "Don Reston." I almost fainted. "Hi, Amy here," I answered in a cheerful voice. Hi, Amy, this is, Don," he stammered. "Oh, Don Reston from my caller ID?" I laughed, and before he could answer, I chimed in, "Hey, Don, how's it going?" Well, I don't know if it's true or not. But Phil said, that I should ask you to come with me this weekend to Eagle Ridge Resort and Spa in Galena. That he'd pay for it, he replied nervously. I'd love to see that resort. I've heard good things about it. Are we going to sleep in the same bed? Teased I. If that's okay with you. You want an almost 7-month pregnant woman in your bed? Isn't that disgusting? For once, he wasn't nervous or stammering. Actually, Amy, you've never been this attractive since you started showing. Even though my breasts have gotten bigger since pregnancy, I don't have a D cup or bigger, I teased. I think you'll find that I'm not as much of a breast lover as you think I am, he teased back. I paused for effect and then said, Okay. What time on Friday are you picking me up? How about 2 p.m. to be back Sunday around 3 p.m., he replied. I'll be ready, I said with a wide smile on my face, and ended the conversation. Don was no gentleman during our weekend at Eagle Ridge Resort. Shortly after he picked me up, he started wrapping his arms around me. He looked like an octopus. He also showed me a container of small blue pills. This may be my only chance to nail you, and I'm going to make the most of it, he smirked. The bellboy barely had time to leave our room before Don started having sex with me. We had a nice dinner. After dinner, we took a leisurely stroll around the resort grounds and danced to a couple slow songs before he led me and then carried me back to our room. After a morning toilet and a communal shower, Don fed me before breakfast. Then we had sex again before breakfast, then had breakfast, then had sex again after breakfast. Then he let me go for a massage, play in the pool for a while, and relax. He must have been swallowing those little blue pills like Tic Tacs, because he always seemed to be ready. Saturday night, our second and presumably last night together, after he seemed to have made love to me, not just sex, resulting in emotional and physical rapture, he wanted to say something. Before I fell asleep, he murmured in my ear, The biggest regret of my life is that I didn't get to you, Phil, on that bike ride where we first met. Maybe now you'd have my baby in your belly instead of his, and we'd be super happily married. After another sex session early Sunday morning, and 2 more love-making sessions before and after brunch on Sunday, we got into Don's car to drive home. I was completely exhausted but felt better than I had ever felt in my life. Before I fell asleep in the car, a strange thought popped into my head. I don't think I can put the genie back in the bottle, nor do I want to. Nearly 6 years after a weekend at Eagle Ridge Resort, I was driving with my family on Interstate 90 in South Dakota, heading toward Rapid City in hopes of catching up on a missed vacation from 6 years ago. As we drove, my husband stroked my 4-month pregnant belly and said, I can't wait for you to get a little older. Asshole, I laughed. At this point, I had to turn around to quiet the outrage of my 5-year-old daughter Sandra and 3-year-old son Rick, who were sitting in their car seats in the back seat. Then I turned to Don and said, I'm even more excited to see Mount Rushmore than I was the first time. Yes, that's right, my husband Don. After our weekend at Eagle Ridge, Don never took me back to the house we shared with Phil. I've been living with him ever since. My divorce from Phil became final a month after my daughter Sandra was born, and Don paid for everything. My son, of course, belongs to Don, as does the second girl growing in my belly. Phil was furious for a while, but when I explained to him that Don was just better, he doesn't drink, never cheats on his girlfriends, and is rich, he backed off. I didn't bother telling him that Don was also so much better in bed than any other man I'd ever been with, that it was like comparing a high school quarterback to Tom Brady. That information would hurt Phil's ego, but it's true. Although Don and I have sole custody of Sandra, I allow Phil free visitation and don't make him pay child support. He and Kathy will become parents in a month or so, and I'm sure things will be even smoother then. Yeah, that's right. Phil and Kathy are married. Although I didn't tell him, Jim found out about Kathy's extracurricular activities and immediately kicked her out. Phil picked her up, and since they are both cheaters, I figure they will be lenient with each other, and maybe things will work out. I let Katie back into my life to make things easier with Phil, but I'm a cautious friend. I made it clear to her that if she ever touches Dawn, I will kill her. I'm living an amazing life. My personal genie that I let out of the bottle at Eagle Ridge has fulfilled more than just my 3 wishes. He grants one of my wishes almost every night when I want him to. The end! Subscribe to my channel. Thank you!